A lot has changed in the last 75 years, but one thing has stayed consistent through time. APBA Baseball's basic game is still essentially the game that it was when it first started. Now, I know as well as you do that there have been changes to APBA over the years. You've got more funky letters on cards that cause things to happen. You've got double column cards. You've got symbols on cards that let guys steal bases. But honestly, the way that the game functions at the most fundamental level is the same as it has always been. The game revolves around this, the hitter's card. The black numbers correspond to dice rolls. You combine a red die and a white die together, so a roll of 5 red and 2 white would be read as 52. You then look at the card, Mickey Mantle's card for example, and see that the 52 corresponds to a 27. You then look at the board that corresponds with your base situation and read the result. With the bases empty, it's a ground out to third base. With the runner on first, it's a double play ball. It's really that simple, and this is a system that has been around for almost a century. Well, it all started with Clifford Van Beek's obscure board game called National Pastime. The National Pastime cards look and work just like APBA cards, and the APBA playing boards were directly based on the National Pastime boards. In that sense, APBA isn't really an original game, it's more like a massively renovated version of an existing game. But even then we have to be really careful about how we phrase things. You see, APBA is significantly different from National Pastime despite the surface level similarities. And yes, I'm talking about the original 1950 APBA season and the original boards that went with it. So here, I'll show you. By just looking at Lou Gehrig's National Pastime card, we can predict what his batting average will be. He's got 12 results that fit between numbers 1 and 11. These are always base hits in the National Pastime system. Gehrig has 3 14s, which are always walks and are never at-bats. He's also got 1 40, which was designed to never charge an at-bat. Out of 36 chances, only 32 will charge Gehrig an at-bat. 12 base hits divided by 32 chances equals 0.375, which is Gehrig's expected batting average. Now in real life, Gehrig hit 379. Now for the sake of comparison, let's look at Joe DiMaggio's original 1950 season APBA card, the one first printed in 1951. DiMaggio has 10 hit numbers. He also has 4 of those 14s and 1 40. Under the National Pastime calculating system, his card would hit 323, which is 10 divided by 31. In real life, however, Joltin' Joe hit 301, a pretty big difference. The difference is that these 8s and 9s aren't always base hits in APBA. That's because of APBA's pitching system, which is the most obvious and the most famous of the APBA innovations. National Pastime had no pitching system at all. In APBA, however, pitchers have the ability to stop hitters, well, some of the time at least. So for example, this is a reprinted version of Dizzy Trout's original 1951 season pitcher's card. As you can see, he was given a C grade. Now let's say we've got that 1950 DiMaggio card up against Trout. Joe rolls a 51 for a 9. With nobody on base, what would have been a base hit turns into a pop-up. Now if Joe rolled a 31 for an 8, things would be different. A grade C pitcher simply can't stop an 8, and so Joe gets a single. Now if Joe was facing the 1951 Don Newcomb, who received a grade B, things would be different. That 9 with nobody on base would have become a hit. Meanwhile, that 8 would be a fly ball to center field. This general pattern holds for the most part across all the APBA playing boards with one notable exception. With runners on first and third, all bets are off. The grade B pitcher can only prevent play result 7, which it usually can do nothing about. The grade C pitcher, meanwhile, can only prevent play result 8, which we usually think of as being reserved for the B. In other words, you always have to check no matter how many times you've played APBA. You could just go based on feel, but you're going to wind up being wrong. Trust me, I have experience. Now, in the very first APBA season, only one pitcher received grade A. That was Jim Constanti of the Phillies, and you'd better believe that there was some hometown bias there. Of course, as APBA developed over time, the grade A became much more common. In general, an A pitcher can stop all kinds of base hits, such as here with the bases empty. While he's not invincible, he certainly is powerful in most situations, including with runners on first and third. But an A grade isn't as special as it once was. Chalk that up to grade inflation. And speaking of grade inflation, there's always this old card, this Grover Cleveland Alexander card, printed with APBA's original 1915 Philadelphia Phillies Great Team of the Past set back in the late 1950s. Notice the interesting grade here, this A and C, or both an A pitcher and a C pitcher. Normally, Alexander will pitch just like a standard A starting pitcher. However, with a runner on first base, a normal A starter gives up a base hit when faced with play result 9. Alexander would then change to a C pitching grade, stopping the base hit. Now, it's rare, but sometimes you will run into an A and B pitcher like this 1990 Dennis Eckersley card. If Eckersley somehow faces a runner on third base and the batter rolls an 8, it will still be an out since he changes from an A to a B. There are some people who get really deep into the difference between an A and B pitcher and an A and C pitcher, and there are some people who will swear that the A and C is the better grade. This chart from the APBA blog says it all. The A and B stops extra singles in 3 situations, the A and C stops extra singles in only 1. However, you're a lot more likely to see a runner on first base than any of the other 3 base situations. So the argument is that you would rather stop the batter with the runner on first than potentially stop runs from scoring in more rare situations. But of course, you have to take into consideration the distribution of base hit numbers in whatever set you're using, and that's a little bit too complex for today's video. And you need to take into consideration the existence of double columns, like on this 1955 Jerry Coleman card. So let's say you rolled an 11 with Coleman hitting. The result is a 0, which means you move to the second group of results. Even if you then roll one of these 8s, the pitcher has no way of stopping Coleman from getting a base hit. The reason for this has to do with how the cards were formulated. Those zeros count as full base hits for batting average calculation purposes. Now, APBA's simplistic grade system has received a lot of criticism over the years. People complain all the time that there are only 4 pitching grades. Well, technically there's 6 since you have the inflated grades, but whatever. There's actually a bit more to the system than meets the eye, and you might not know about this if you've never actually, played the game. Okay, take another look at this Bullet Bob Turley 1955 card. You see this W next to his pitching grade? That means he's wild. In a number of situations, the W will turn an otherwise innocuous result into a walk. Most notably, with a runner on first base, the W turns a 12 from a potential double play ball into a walk. Now, the thing about the 12 is that every single player in APBA has at least one. In other words, if a W pitcher's on the mound, there is at least an additional 1 in 36 chance that the batter will walk. Now, Turley has an X as well, that's a strikeout rating. The X turns certain play result numbers into strikeouts, like you can see here on this bases empty chart. Dutch Leonard has a Y, which is another strikeout rating. Like the X, the Y turns certain play result numbers into strikeouts, though it doesn't come up quite as often. X's are for the pitchers with the higher strikeout totals. And in that spirit of grade inflation, you have cards like the 1985 Dwight Gooden. He received both an X and a Y. Now, sometimes the strikeout ratings can backfire and turn a double play into just a single out. That's part of the fun of the game. Good ratings don't always help you. Gary Staley here has the last of the special pitching symbols we're going to look at today, a Z. That Z prevents play result number 14 from being a walk with a runner on first, or runners on first and second, or the bases loaded. There are other more modern ratings as well. There's a ZZ rating, a ZZZ rating, a K rating, and so on. They all tend to do similar things. They decrease walks, they'll increase strikeouts, decrease strikeouts, and so on. But the fascinating thing is that this creates a lot more variability in pitching in the system than you would think at first glance. Some hitters, like Eddie Robinson, have an S rating, meaning that they're slow. So if Robinson is on first base, there's another runner on second, and the batter rolls an 18, Robinson will be thrown out trying to go to third. Meanwhile, guys like Phil Rizzuto have an F, which means he's fast. So if the scooter's on at second base with runners on first and second, and the batter rolls a 39, and the defense is in fielding index 1, Rizzuto actually beats out a potential double play. Of course, if you want, you can mess all of this up by playing it safe, meaning that runners only try to advance one base at a time. Most APBA players don't really play it safe all that often. In fact, I can't remember the last time I played it safe while playing a game. If you're working on a replay and you don't have a rooting interest in the particular game you're playing, you want to make sure that you get a reasonable number of outs on the base paths. It's a very nice feature, though, for games where you're playing competitively against another person. Now, technically speaking, most of the instructions are on this board, one that seems to be largely neglected among APBA players. Personally, I rarely even look at it. If you read it, though, you'll notice that the instructions for setting up fielding are front and center, even before the flow of the game is explained. Guys like Rizzuto have fielding ratings, a single number that encompasses both range and air totals. Adding together every fielder's fielding rating will give you a number, and that number tells you which of the 3 fielding indexes to use for the team. There's a separate set of instructions for infield fielding only, which is the infield fielding index number. I suppose this is so the good outfielders won't somehow cover up for bad shortstops and second basemen. And there's also a pretty fancy chart for individual fielding ratings, which means you can get even more down in the weeds about who is and who is not a good fielder. Now, the unfortunate part about the fielding system is that there really isn't much randomness. It just is what it is, and the fielding ratings don't change as the game goes on. The cool part, though, is that you can see how different positions differ in importance. So, if you need to use an emergency player in the outfield, he'll receive a 1. That's not horrible since the maximum rating is a 3, and those are small numbers. However, if you need an emergency shortstop, he'll receive a 5, where the maximum rating is a 10. So if you have to use some random guy at shortstop for whatever reason, your entire team's fielding will suffer. It's actually a pretty well thought through system. And now comes the sacrifice booklet. The sacrifice and hit and run booklet is actually pretty much ignored among people who analyze the game, and you'll see why right away. The sacrifice booklet uses the same play results, but of course all the hits turn into successful sacrifice bunts. There are some rare exceptions, such as the 11 with a runner on first base. There are also times when disaster will strike, such as a 23 or 24 with runners on first and third. Interestingly, with runners on second and third, a 6, 9, 10, or 11 are all singles. I'm not sure why so many numbers wind up being base hits. Now that's kind of the gamification of APBA, I suppose. Of course, if you're going to roll numbers like that, you're better off swinging away instead of bunting, but you will find times where you want to use a sacrifice booklet a lot, especially if you're playing in a dead ball era season. The hit and run play is a little bit better if you get a base hit, though some of the extra base hits have been weakened to prevent overuse of the play. Pitchers are also better able to stop singles if you run the hit and run, another disincentive. You also need to make sure that the runner on first has an 11 if you run that hit and run play. Play result number 11 almost always results in a stolen base. In other words, the changes here to the common play result numbers 13, a strikeout, and 14, a walk, are designed to make sure that you only keep the hit and run on if the guy on first base is actually known for stealing bases. It's another mechanism to keep you honest, and it's also a pretty good one. And then there's the famous base hit for play result number 31, which is usually a lazy fly ball to center field. This here is a sort of a marker. APBA will give extra 31 play result numbers to hitters who the company feels are good at batting in hit and run situations. So for example, Pee Wee Reese of the 1955 Brooklyn Dodgers has 3 of those 31s on his card. In contrast, his teammate Rube Walker only has 1. Now there are a few really quick things I want to go over that most APBA players are familiar with, but might be new to you if you've never played the game. For example, play result number 23 almost always causes an injury or something strange to happen, so this example comes with a runner on third. With runners on first and second, the pitcher winds up ejected from the game if you're in fielding column 2. And famously, the game is called because of rain with runners on first and third if you roll a 23. That rainout result comes straight from the National Pastime boards. APBA literally copied this over, making no changes. Interestingly, all pitchers in National Pastime have play result 23 on their cards. So for example, Jack Russell here of the Boston Red Sox got his on dice roll 25, which is usually a hit. APBA uses the same pattern. Clem Labine, who does almost nothing but strike out, has a 23 on play result 43. Notice, by the way, that Labine also has a 1 on 11, which is kind of odd for a guy who didn't even hit 100. That's because he hit 3 home runs in real life in 1955, the only 3 home runs of his major league career. This is the sort of story that seems unbelievable, but it really did happen, believe it or not. Now, one thing that even old APBA vets like me tend to forget is that a pitcher who comes in during the middle of an inning gets a temporary 1-grade boost for the first batter he faces. I think I've always ignored this rule. Pitcher grades can advance in APBA, making it one of the rare board games where the pitcher can grow stronger as the game goes on. Of course, the pitchers can also lose their effectiveness if they give up a lot of runs. Now, the company says that these optional rules won't change the won-loss record, which I find frankly pretty dubious. And in the old APBA tradition, there was a plea to not ask the game company for the difference between an earned run and an unearned run. J. Richard Seitz apparently hated receiving mail. Did you know that the How to Play APBA board tells you that the game is more realistic if you play 2-player instead of solo? The same board also recommends using at least a 4-man pitching rotation, which can be hard when you realize that the base set used to only include 20 players per team. Anyway, I'm rambling a little bit here. Now before we finish though, I do want to touch on a few strategies that you should keep in mind when you play the APBA baseball basic game. The first is to remember that players are almost never caught stealing. Caught stealing generally will only happen when the player behind the guy on base rolls one of the unusual play result numbers, something like a 39 or a 40. Meanwhile, stolen base numbers like 11 and sometimes 10 result in automatic steals, which means that the defense can do nothing to stop it. Ricky Henderson's 1987 card here has a bunch of asterisks next to play result 14. There are 5 in all. That means that he steals second automatically after a walk. So think about that. Ricky steals second automatically on a high percentage of his play result numbers, and the only way that he's caught stealing is if the guy behind him has a bad roll. The obvious trick is to make sure the guy hitting behind him doesn't have a lot of bad roll numbers, and then let Ricky steal as much as possible. Another tip is to remember that the defensive system is simple and can be easily exploited if you play players out of position. Don Newcomb, for example, has an amazing batting card in the 1955R set. This is the sort that you would expect for an outfielder. Instead of fooling around with Robert Borowski in the outfield, you can stick Newcomb out there, take the 1-point penalty for using a man not rated to play in the outfield, and enjoy Don's incredible batting card. This naturally gives you an incentive to start somebody like the 1915 Babe Ruth in the outfield on days when he isn't pitching, which I suppose is somewhat realistic. The issue here, though, is that the hitting aspects of the game were quite well developed, while things like base stealing and fielding simply weren't all that well developed. And then you have sample size issues like with this 1974 Ken Holtzman card. Anyway, there you have it. I believe that that's all the basic information about the APBA baseball basic game that you'd ever need to know or would ever want to know. I've probably missed some stuff, so let me know about that in the comments. And eventually I'll get to the myriad of innovations and other developments over the years that have made the APBA community as multifaceted and complex as it is today. Anyway, APBA itself is a simple game, but it has a lot of surprises and a lot of twists that you really might not expect. I'd love to know what you think about it, whether you're an old veteran of the game like me or somebody who's never played it before.